My name is Kevin Navratil. I'm a political science faculty member, and I'm also the Democracy Commitment Coordinator, where we plan campus events to try to promote civic literacy. I'm joined today by my friends and colleagues, Dr. Darren Schreck to my left, and Mary Faflies Dunkel. So today we have a few different topics that we planned on talking about, and then we also wanted to open it up to you to see what kind of questions that you had about the election. So we're going to talk about whether this is the most important election of our lifetime. We hear that a lot. I think we hear that every 2 to 4 years. So we'll kind of chime in on what we think about that. Related to that, I think we're going to talk about why this election matters, not just for the presidential race, but for the House of Representatives, for the Senate, and then perhaps a little bit of some statewide races that will help determine the state legislature and Illinois Senate. And then we will talk a little bit about the current status of the presidential race, really just about polling and what we see today. And 4 weeks from today, October 22nd, also at 9:30, the three of us are going to have an event that focuses on the Electoral College, how it works, which states are likely going to determine our next president, and more details about the presidential election. So we'll save a lot of that for 4 weeks from now. And then if we get time, we're going to look at undecided voters, how many there are, how they might break one way or the other. So that's our topics today. But again, feel free to ask questions along the way to make this more interactive. So one quick plug that I'll make, I got my vote shirt. Some of you have heard this before, but you know, we have an election day on November 5th. But for many of us, the election is either already started in places like Pennsylvania, or ballots in Illinois, if you vote by mail, are going to be sent in 2 days. So the election is actually a rolling election, and in some places like Illinois, many of us vote well before election day. So one thing I'd like to just put out there, if you do a Google search for Illinois Board of Elections, the first link should be the Illinois State Board of Elections. There's a lot of great resources here for you, including online registration, polling place locator. And then I just wanted to show you that link about online voter registration. When you pull that up, towards the bottom, it gives you details about who can register to vote, how you have to be a US citizen and so forth, live in the same precinct for 30 days. And then if you go to the bottom, notice this little area here, you can register to vote or update an existing registration for anybody who may have changed their name or moved residences. Make sure you do that. All right, the sooner the better. So that's my quick plug on the voter registration. So with that in mind, I thought I'd start off by asking, again, we hear it often in the media that this is the most important election of our lifetime. And so I thought I'd put it to our panel members today to see what their thoughts are on whether this is indeed the most important election of our lifetimes.
Would you like me to start? Okay. Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here. My name's Dr. Darren Schreck. I teach political science at the college. The way I want to start off is just basically telling you that democracy matters. In this country, we take a lot of things for granted, and we look for the next quick fix instead of fully appreciating what we have in front of us. We should be out there voting, protesting responsibly, organizing within our communities, getting to know our neighbors, and being a part of the nation's great experiment, which is being in a democratic process. But instead, we basically sit back and we let others decide the future for them or for ourselves. And when you do that, you've given up on what the founding fathers believed in, what Abraham Lincoln believed in, what Frederick Douglass, Susan B. Anthony, Rosa Parks, Cesar Chavez, and many others like Martin Luther King and what they've fought for and what they've believed in. And what they fought for and what they believed in was our democratic process. What you see at today's local and state levels, sometimes we've seen, or many times I should say, we've seen people come up with laws that make it difficult for us to vote. And even if we are voting, sometimes when the voting goes off without a hitch, the votes of several people of all backgrounds, whether you're white, black, Hispanic, Asian, gay, straight, male, female, young or old, we find that people of all backgrounds their votes may not be counted. In Georgia currently, that's an example. So with this mindset, we talk about why this election is so important. This mindset that we say these practices that we have that are trying to stop people from voting are not new in our nation, but they've been amplified by the presidency and candidacy of Donald Trump. His reelection would only continue to have these out of control mechanisms that have been put into place. They will challenge and subvert our democracy. So folks, what I say is that when we hear about this election being the most important election of our lifetime, it really is, because democracy matters. So I encourage you this November or even early to go out and vote, to protest responsibly, to be part of the fabric in our community, to get to know our neighbors and talk about our differences that are out there and be part of this democratic process. Thank you.
I have to follow that up. Good morning, everybody. My name is Mary Fleece Dunkel. No pressure at all. I teach history and political science and sociology, and I'm also the college's study abroad coordinator. So if you want to study abroad in Greece this summer, come talk to me, please. We'll plug there. And I'm sure that we're going to be laying out, echoing a few cliches, and it is a cliche, but sometimes cliches are true, right? One of the other cliches I will throw out there is that the notion that democracy dies not with a whimper, not with a bang, but with a whimper. In other words, it doesn't happen like with this big moment where all of a sudden we're like, oh my God, democracy is over as we know it. It happens quietly and happens slowly. And I wonder if historians are going to look back on 2024 and say that this was a pivotal year. This is one of those years where this is where it started to come to an end, or if they're going to say it maybe happened before. I hope not, but I will say that having taught for many, many years, I used to go through elections and I would think to myself, well, they're very important, but I came to realize the older I got that no matter who won, my life wouldn't fundamentally really change. Things would kind of go on as they always did, regardless if it was a Republican candidate or a Democratic candidate. For the most part, life continued day to day. This is the first time in my entire life where I am not feeling that way. I'm truly worried. I think when you teach history, you teach politics like we do, I think we tend to take more of a relative approach to things, that things will always kind of have a way of working themselves out, and they tend to kind of keep going. But this is a time where I'm truly concerned about whether or not our democracy can continue in its form, because we face some existential threats that we've never faced as a country. The idea of Americans not believing in, and I don't mean to scare all of you, I'm scaring myself even just saying these things out loud, but it's true. Whether or not democracy can even can continue when people don't believe in the authenticity of elections, when they don't believe in that that their vote perhaps counts towards anything, or that it's all rigged. Because if it's all rigged, then what do you believe in? Nothing, right? It's not going to make a difference. And I think that's perhaps maybe what some people might be counting on this election. So I echo my colleagues' comments about the importance of voting. Even if we're in a state like Illinois, where you feel like perhaps, depending on your political persuasion, it may not make much of a difference. But we've discussed this multiple times. Elections can come down to sometimes hundreds of votes, can come down to tens of votes sometimes. So if you abdicate you lose your voice. You are not able to participate in the process. I have other reasons why I can get into it, but I'll just kind of leave it that generally. But I'm sure these will come up as well. But I'll leave it there for now.
Right, and it's hard to answer this question without answering the next question about why this election matters with the presidency, House, and Senate. So we will be kind of continuing this discussion, but I just would reiterate the same kind of points that my colleagues brought up. But just looking at the presidential election alone, which I think is the race that many Americans are focused on. You have Donald Trump, who of course was president from 2000. He won the 2016 election, so he served from 2017 to 2021, early January. And then Kamala Harris, who ended up replacing Joe Biden on the Democratic ticket. They have two really fundamental differences, I think, on most issues, and we'll talk more about that throughout today. So policy is generally one way that we distinguish candidates and parties, and that's really important. But to me, before you can have legitimate policy disagreements about taxing and about immigration, there has to be shared norms and rules about elections. And to me, now I think if you are a avid Trump supporter, it's likely that you might have some doubts about the authenticity of the 2020 election. So for you, I think this is a really important opportunity to reelect the person that you think won the 2020 election. I happen to believe, based on the evidence that is available to us, that that Donald Trump lost the 2020 election. And I'd be happy to talk more in depth with anybody who's interested about why that is the case and about why Republican lawyers also have made that case that the election was not stolen, it was lost. There's a group of several Republican lawyers who wrote dozen-page brief on this. You could also look at state level officials. Rusty Bauer in the state of Arizona, who was, I believe, the Speaker of House of the state legislature. And this is somebody who knocked on doors for Trump. This is somebody who is an avid Trump supporter. But after the 2020 election, when Arizona went towards Biden, there was a significant pressure for Rusty Bauer to change the outcome of the election at the state level. You know, look it up. Look up what his stance is on this. You could look at places like Georgia, Brad Raffensperger, the state election official, the phone calls that he received from the former president about trying to, come up with the votes and to just find 12,000 votes and so forth. So to me, before we can have real disagreements about policy, we got to agree that the winner of an election should take office and that we should have a peaceful transition of power. We didn't have that in 2020. I think that is a huge stain on our republic. And I think that, it is the most important election of our lifetime to make sure that we get it right this time and making sure that we have a peaceful transition of power, that the loser of the election accepts defeat, whether that's Kamala Harris, whether that's Donald Trump, because I worry about that precedent being set that you don't like the outcome, you can start pressuring state officials, you can try to, change the electoral college vote and pressure the vice president and all of those things. So I'll leave it at that. But I think it is not hyperbole to suggest that this is the most important election of our lifetime. Follow-ups?
Well, like what you're saying about, if we're going to talk about 2020, we have to be like rational about things. You can complain all you want that your candidate didn't win. And in history, everybody has voted. If you have voted before, I'm sure there are candidates you have voted for at the local, state, or national level who have lost. And most of the time, those candidates just move on. So if we're talking about 2020, I just want you to think of it this way. How is it that somebody at the top of the ticket, meaning Donald Trump, says that there's voter fraud, but everybody else who's on the ballot in all of those states who have lost did not say that their vote was, that their loss was fraudulent? Why is it that everybody was smart enough in those states to say that, okay, let's rig it so that Trump loses, but nobody was smart enough to rig it at the state and local level for all of those candidates? Let's just be rational about it. So we're saying that at the top of the ticket, okay, we fixed it, but everybody else, well, that was legit. So we're moving on to 2024 now, and we're talking about the same things that we talked about 4 years ago. It's unbelievable that we're still talking about something that was proposed by a losing candidate. That is unheard of, right? That we've never really had that in our nation's history. When somebody loses, they're going to claim fraud. Usually what happens is when somebody loses, you just move on. And we do. And like as Professor Faflis Dunkel was saying, that we're not having that peaceful transition. We've put it in people's minds that what we could say is that if you lose, just claim fraud. If you lose, just say it's rigged. And then we can say if that's rigged, then we can say that something else at the federal government level is rigged, such as we were talking about on our podcast, that former President Trump was saying that the statistics from crime being down according to the federal government, according to the FBI, those are fraudulent numbers. So if you don't agree with something, just claim fraud. And that is a dangerous precedent that we've been seeing in this country. And I think we've been seeing it at basically at the national level from one candidate and that candidate's followers and voters.
Yeah. And I think what's ironic is that we're in a time, I think that you both agree with this, that elections are the most accurate than they probably have been in terms of like transparency, what you can see in voter fraud, and that is down across the board. The election of 2020 was actually seen as probably one of the most correct in terms of how the votes were counted. But again, if we seem to label something and we just believe it without necessarily having proof, that's a major problem. And there's been elections in history. I was just thinking, well, Professor Schreck was talking about like 1960, Nixon versus Kennedy, which, by the way, Illinois at the time, guys, was a swing state back in the day. And basically, I mean, it's hard to believe that, but that was probably one of those elections where probably President, who later on became President Nixon, at the time he was Vice President Nixon, but probably could have asked for a recount because it was such a close call. But he didn't. He accepted the results and he moved on. Same with Al Gore in 2000, where there was an attempt to a recount, but that was stopped by the U.S. Supreme Court. But he accepted those results gracefully and moved on. Which, I mean, there are plenty of things to say about the U.S. Supreme Court, about abortion rights, about all those things. And I think that's something that we'll probably keep talking about, why this election is so important. I don't know if you want to talk about that now or
I think that's a good segue. And just to reiterate that I think collectively what we're saying is these candidates are going to come and go. Even if they win, they can serve a total of 8 years in office for president. But these institutions, one of the bedrocks of our republic is our election system. And so having the public to view our institutions as legitimate is something that carries forward for all of us. And again, I think even if you are somebody who believes Trump won the 2020 election, and he's got a good chance of winning election in 2024, you want him to be viewed as a legitimate winner, and you don't want the other side to storm the Capitol and try to overturn the election and things like that. So yes, to segue, why is this election important? So what's at stake? So we'll talk about the presidency a bit, and of course, 4 weeks from now we're going to have an election or discussion on the Electoral College. But that is not the only office that's going to be on the ballot. I also urge you to look up Ballotpedia, where you can type in your zip code and street address and find your own individual ballot beforehand, so you can kind of see, depending upon where you live, you might even have some county level races, some judges, and it's good to research them beforehand. So we have the presidency that we expect to be decided by a few thousand votes in a few states. But we also have the U.S. House of Representatives, where, again, we expect a handful of races, perhaps maybe 30 throughout the United States, to determine which party has the majority of the U.S. House of Representatives. And for the U.S. Senate, we've got probably 7 races or so that are really competitive. And it looks like right now we've got about a 51 to 49 Senate, where Democrats have 51 senators, so a slight majority. The expectations, and I think we'll show you this in a moment, I think Republicans are probably slightly favored to have about the same advantage, maybe 51, 52 senators based on the 2024 elections. So maybe, Darren, did you want to get us started with the House and Senate races? Do you want me to pull up the Cook?
Yeah, if you don't mind. Yeah. A great website to look at is the Cook Political Report. I use it in my classes. My students are doing a project right now about toss-ups that are in the House of Representatives. Right now, there are, according to the Cook Political Report, there are 32 toss-ups for the House of Representatives. Roughly half of them, or I should say less than half of them, are like Democratic seats, and then the other half are Republican seats. But you'll see it right here on the screen. You have right now 174 solid Democratic seats, 192 solid Republican seats, and you're looking at what's in the middle. So roughly, I have it at 32, they have it about 24, so you're trying to get to 218. And for all those people who live in Illinois, which are all here, but whoever's watching online as well, Illinois, it's pretty boring. There's nothing really that's competitive on either side if it's a Democratic or Republican seat. So most of the seats that you're going to find will be in Michigan, Pennsylvania. I was recently in Michigan visiting our son at college and watching a football game on television. Every commercial was a Trump commercial. a Harris commercial, a commercial for the United States Senate, and I believe there were a few commercials for the House of Representatives. So if you're living in Michigan, it's a very competitive state. You'll see the ones in the center there. That's okay. The ones that were in the center are considered to be the toss-ups on the website, and you'll find that there are many states all across the country. Many of these that you'll find that are toss-ups as well are found in the state of New York, which is, we'll see right there. You'll find that there are 11 seats that are Democratic that are toss-up, 13 seats that are toss-up in the gray that are Republican, and you find when you click on those sites, you'll see who actually runs the seat now or holds the seat, and which makes it really difficult for incumbents if you're trying to compete or if it's an open seat. I tend to look at it this way. The candidate that raises the most money in those seats and the candidate that has the best ground operation in those seats will be the winner. Doesn't matter if it's a Democrat or Republican. So if you're trying to look for a Republican to win, you have to look to see if they've raised enough money. A great website for that is opensecrets.org. You have all of the money that comes in on both sides, both Democrat and Republican, who's raising the most money, who's spending the most money. I tend to see that the candidate that raises the most money usually has the best chance of winning. On the Senate side, there are 34 seats that are being contested, but only 2 of them are considered to be toss-ups. One is in Montana, held by Jon Tester. It's a Democratic seat. The other being held by Sherrod Brown from Ohio, which is also a Democratic seat. You'll see if you go online and visit their websites or you visit YouTube to see who's running political ads, you'll find a lot of political ads being run in both Montana and Ohio. So really what it comes down to when you're looking at the House of Representatives, you're looking at about 34, between 25 and let's say 34 seats that are being contested. And on the Senate side, you see the gray one right there. You have a Michigan seat that's open, which is now considered to be a toss-up. You have Sherrod Brown's, which is a toss-up. And then I've also said that the Tester seat is considered to be a toss-up, even though it says lean Republican now. But all 3 of those are Democratic seats.
And just, yeah, I guess you just said that, but looking at that, the lean Democrat, Arizona currently held by a Democrat, Nevada, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, all held by a Democrat. The toss-up, also both held by Democrats, and then the lean Republicans district is also currently held by a Democrat. So in particular, that Montana and Ohio, those are 2 states that Donald Trump and Republicans have done very well in, at least kind of 5-point advantage plus. So it's not impossible for a Democrat to win a state that is more of a red state that votes Republican, but it's a real uphill challenge, especially in a presidential election cycle where the voter turnout's going to be higher. So it just kind of works this way where sometimes in an election cycle, one party is playing defense in more places than the other, and that's kind of the Democrats this cycle. So sometimes we interpret that like, oh, Republicans or people just prefer Republicans in the Senate this election cycle. It really kind of just random of which seats, they serve a 6-year term, so every 2 years about 1/3 of them are up for election, and so it really just kind of it matters which of those 33 to 34 seats are up in every 2 years.
Right. So what I would add to this, because this is more my colleague's area of expertise, but I'm going to kind of bring it a little bit wider here. In case you're sitting in the audience right now and you're wondering, well, why do I really care who wins the House of Representatives, or do I really care who wins the Senate? Just note that if let's say, an electoral tie, which again, the race that's going on right now won't necessarily, would not impact what's going on with the 2024 election. But let's say in the future, if there was an electoral tie in which we will be covering the Electoral College on October 22nd, so we urge you to come to that, attend that talk. Then the election goes to the House of Representatives to decide, right? If it's depending on who wins the Senate, who's in control, party controls the Senate. The Senate Judiciary Committee confirms Supreme Court justices for whoever the president is. So again, if you don't really kind of grasp why those things might be important, this microphone seems to be going in and out a little bit, that is a major reason why. So depending on what issue is important to you, whether it's reproductive rights or, thank you, or others, that's why the Senate and the House, thank you. No worries, are rather important.
Yeah, I think that's a great point about why Senate and House control matters. For those of us in American government class who are interested in how a bill becomes a law, we remember that it has to pass in equal form. Any legislation, so let's say immigration legislation, has to pass both the House of Representatives and the Senate in equal form. All of the language has to be identical. And then, of course, the president has to sign it into law. So what we've had in the recent presidential election years, 2016, 2020, is where the party that wins the presidency has won a majority of both the House and Senate. So we have this unified government where the same party controls the House, the Senate, and the presidency. That makes it a little easier for them to pass their agenda. But those majorities that they've had have been really narrow. And so it just takes a defection or two from somebody within your party and then the other party all voting in lockstep to kind of block legislation. So to Mary's point, let's say Kamala Harris wins the presidency and I don't know, Justice Sotomayor retires due to health reasons. She's a liberal justice. So perhaps Kamala will nominate a liberal Supreme Court justice. It is very unlikely that a Republican majority Senate would even hold a hearing and seat and vote to confirm a Democratic or a liberal nominee. There's precedent for that. When Obama was president and Scalia passed away and Obama had nominated Merrick Garland, and the Republican-controlled Senate didn't have a single hearing on Merrick Garland. So it's things like that. Also, there's been speculation so there's a lot of executive appointees. Think about somebody like Secretary of Education or, Secretary of Defense. There's about 4,000 positions that require Senate approval. And again, it's likely that a Republican-controlled Senate might block any type of nominee that they feel is too far liberal. So it's going to matter for Senate control for nominations, of course, any legislation, and I think a lot of us, raise your hand if you're satisfied how things are in the United States, that everything is going perfectly well, right? Yeah, and a lot of us don't raise our hands for anything, I get that, but I think a lot of us expect government to be doing more. Now, what that more is might differ, and that issues might differ amongst us, but I think we generally want them to tackle some big issues. It could be the deficit, it could be immigration, healthcare, the list goes on and on. It makes it harder to do that if there's divided government where, let's say Trump is the president and we have a Democratic House, or Harris is the president and we have a Republican Senate. It's just going to make it harder for them to be able to pass their agenda. So that's one way that it matters. Do you want to add to other ways? So the question now, we're moving on to number 3, is like, why does this election matter? So not just who wins control of the House, the presidency, and the Senate, but what are some potential maybe policy implications, foreign policy, ways that this election could matter to people in the audience and Americans throughout the United States?
Well, I think that when we look at the issues that are out there, there are the same issues that we talk about every year: immigration, taxes, what's going on in Ukraine, what's going on in Gaza. There are things that we all have to address on a daily basis. And I think the frustration that we have is that we're in a situation where our government officials would rather just, and it doesn't matter which side you're on, would rather argue about the issue and not solve it, so that it looks like that you're being progressive on the issue with a small p progressive, that you're taking action. But if you try to solve the problem and you solve it, then you really don't have anything to argue about anymore. So I think what we have is a situation where we see the issues right there. It's sort of like when you, as a student, are trying to get a paper done. You got to get the paper done so you get the grade. You're not going to just sit there and sit there and sit there and not get it done. So what happens is, because there's a consequence if you don't get it done. Well, what's the consequence in our government that if you don't fix a problem when it comes to the border? What's the solution? What's the consequence if you don't fix the problem that you have in Gaza? What's the consequence if you don't fix our tax situation? There doesn't seem like there is a consequence. So what we do is we just pass it on down the line. So when you're looking at who you're trying to elect, let's say for the House and the Senate, it's one thing to elect the right candidate, but it's another thing to actually get everybody on board to actually fix and solve the problems that we have in this country, which is the biggest issue that we have. We find that we have a lot of gridlock because it's easier just to like filibuster or just argue about something than it is to actually solve it.
Yeah. So I think one of the biggest issues for this, and why this election is so important, is also for reproductive rights and abortion rights in this country. Now, most of you, I think, are probably aware of the fact that in 2022, the Supreme Court reversed a 50-year precedent of allowing for abortion rights within. And it was up to the state to regulate how far that should go, right? So for the most part, it was decided that a woman has a right in the first trimester of pregnancy to seek an abortion. Beyond that, most states had regulations in the second trimester, third, et cetera, depending on the woman's health, et cetera. Now, there's been talk about whether or not, depending on who wins this election, obviously if Donald Trump were to become president, there's been talk of a national abortion ban being put across the board, which that means that would affect the state of Illinois. Regardless of what laws we have in place here in Illinois and what protections we have in place in Illinois, that would be across the board. Now, Donald Trump, and as many of you know, and this is not a partisan statement, but sometimes says two things in the same sentence. He'll give you one position on one thing in the beginning of a sentence and then another position by the end of the paragraph. So this idea that he says that he would not sign a national abortion ban, but he also has indicated that he would sign a national abortion ban if that were to come across his desk as president. There are 9 states across the country that have amendments regarding safeguarding reproductive rights, from Arizona to Colorado, Florida, Maryland, Missouri, Montana, Nebraska, Nevada, and South Dakota. This is because no matter in states where they're traditionally so-called red states, when this issue has been on the ballot, people have voted to enshrine or protect abortion rights. So this is a pretty important one. Now, one of the things that Donald Trump has talked about implementing should he become president is this Project 2025 that I'm sure most Americans now say they've heard something about it. They're not quite sure. Project 2025 doesn't necessarily say that it calls for a national abortion ban, but it does call for the withdrawal and the prosecution of the dissemination of mifepristone. Mifepristone, I hear multiple pronunciations of it, and I'm probably mispronouncing it now, but the idea of the so-called abortion pill, right? Or the idea if you're seeking the morning after pill, et cetera. These things would be prosecuted under the law, under laws that go back to the 1870s in the United States, which is kind of an interesting idea. So that's one major issue that is at stake in this particular election. Project 2025 also calls for a few other things too, eliminating protections for civil servants and the idea of appointing political appointees. In other words, it doesn't matter if your expertise might be in education or if your expertise might be in the Department of Justice. We're going to get rid of people and just appoint people based on the whim of whoever is the president, which is also a problem. Getting rid of the Department of Homeland Security, which does have some issues probably, but regarding immigration. I would also link that to the war on, even the notion of concern of terrorism. The reason why the Department of Homeland Security was put in place was after September 11th because of this concern that one department wasn't talking to the next department. I don't think that would improve communication to get rid of the Department of Homeland Security. And for those of you who are fans of Mark Robinson, who is running for governor of North Carolina, pornography would be banned under Project 2025. Should that get put in place? So, not to mention tariffs on imported goods. There's so many issues, which that's probably the one I should have led with, because that means that any goods that you're trying to buy that perhaps come from a nation like China, that tax would be passed along to the consumer, right? That means that, so the idea of a notion of tariffs would never make things cheaper. That's like across the board. Experts confirm that.
I think Donald Trump has had mixed statements on Project 2025, and we should and could have an entire 2-hour session on Project 2025 of all it entails. To be fair, it's like a 900-page document, so there's a lot in here. I could show you, I was trying to find it real quick, of comments he's made about it in the past that said that were supportive of Project 2025, and then more recent ones, including in the debate, where he's like, I don't know anything about Project 2025. So that's for you to kind of sort out on your own. But what is clear is that I'm just reading from at least 140 people who worked in the Trump administration have worked on this Project 2025. And I think more than anything, what they want to have if Trump wins re-election is, unlike the first presidency, he wants to make sure or the people who want Trump to win want to make sure that Trump is surrounded by loyal appointees in the executive branch. We know we have 3 branches of government, but many people in the executive branch are long-term employees who work across administrations. And I think the loyal Trumpers want to make sure that he is surrounded by people who are going to be looking out in his interests and helping him in whatever way. So they're trying to make sure that on day one, they've got like kind of a Rolodex or LinkedIn group of people, thousands of people who could be ready to go to work in some of these appointed positions. There's approximately 4,000 appointed positions. They'd also like to remove about 50,000 people who have been permanent employees across administrations and allow those to be political appointees too that the Trump administration could replace. And so there is a bunch of, on Project 2025, J.D. Vance, is vice presidential candidate, has also written in favor of Project 2025. You can look at what that all entails. Professor Faflis detailed some of it, but it's really just beyond the scope of what we can do in 900 pages or explain in 900 pages. But clearly there's kind of an attempt to hit the ground running and be more prepared for the second Trump administration. So other kind of significance of why this election might matter. So I think climate change is a huge difference between the two candidates. Under the Biden administration, there is the Inflation Reduction Act that created a lot of spending programs and tax incentives for solar, electric cars and so forth. That money is being rolled out. I think a second Trump administration would try to stop and repeal the Inflation Reduction Act. I think things like the Paris Treaty climate accord would be reversed again by the Trump administration. So just kind of different. I think Trump and his administration would be much more concerned about oil and gas exploration domestically and less concerned about, I don't think they're as favorable about wind. It's just kind of an inside joke of some of the things he said about wind turbines and solar and some of the renewables. That would be an area. We could, if you're interested, we could maybe explore more of those. But immigration, I think, would be a big one. There's been talk of removing all the 12+ million undocumented immigrants who happen to live in the United States. What that looks like, I don't think anybody really knows. We also heard about building a wall and having Mexico pay for it. Sometimes we have campaign pledges, and I could do the same for Kamala Harris, right? Where there's, about reducing grocery bills and some of the things that I think she said. Sometimes we have to understand that it's trying to win over voters in the election, knowing that it might be very difficult to ever implement the policy. So sometimes we have to separate the rhetoric from the reality. One thing just in higher education, I think we could have an entire episode about the implications for higher education. As you know, you pay a lot for tuition, but your tuition only covers just about half to less than half of the cost of being here. The state of Illinois, property taxes fill a lot of the other bucket of money to pay for you to be here. But we receive at Moraine Valley about 10%, sometimes more, of our total budget from the federal government in grants. And then, of course, K through 12 schools similarly get around 10 to maybe 15% of their total expenses paid by federal grants. There's been talk of the Trump administration to, any college that is engaged, or any school that is engaged in diversity, equity, inclusion, to potentially have their federal funds revoked. So that's a consequence. So there's just a whole host of things that we could talk about in terms of implications for policy. The last one that I think I'll mention is the Federal Reserve. This is kind of inside baseball details. Sometimes it gets complicated, but I think all of us know interest rates, right? You know that interest rates are currently high. You may have heard how last week the Federal Reserve did reduce interest rates by about 0.5%. That may take a while for it to trickle through to mortgages and car loans and student loans and credit cards and so forth. But one thing Trump's been clear about, even though he has nominated the current chairman of the Federal Reserve, that was his pick, he has pressured, when he was president, Jerome Powell, to lower interest rates. One of the things, when you lower interest rates, it's generally going to improve the economy. Money is going to be cheaper to lend, you're going to have more economic activity. But generally, you lower interest rates when we're in a recession or the economy is shrinking. The idea of the Federal Reserve is they are independent. They make decisions without regards of the next election. And Trump has made comments about making sure that the Federal Reserve makes decisions that he's a successful businessman in his eyes, and he thinks he too has good ideas about what should happen for the economy. So I really worry, and this is maybe, I don't want to rank my worries, but this is one that I think is really concerning, because when you have governments that start tweaking interest rates based on trying to improve the economy before the next election, that's when you can potentially get wild inflation and really disastrous economic results. So that's another potential concern. And of course, Trump is facing 4 court cases. You may have heard about some of those. And I think, too, we'd be remiss without mentioning that at least 2 of those, I think, if Trump were to win the presidency, he could have a huge impact on the Department of Justice, stopping the prosecution and the cases against him. You mentioned Gaza, the war in Palestine with Israel, the war in Ukraine. I think there could be huge differences between these 2 candidates on those issues. So again, we've got about 35 minutes left. So we'll save the last 20 minutes at least for questions and comments. Maybe in the last 7 minutes. We don't want to steal too much of our thunder for our next one. But the current status of the presidential election. Raise your hand if you've heard about public opinion polls kind of showing about the presidential race. If you've heard about any public opinion. Okay, so good, we're raising our hands. A lot of people have heard about those polls. The thing I think I'll start with is that we've never had polls between the 2 major presidential candidates. And to be fair, there are third-party candidates running. And we have each voted for a third-party candidate in our lifetime. So I'm only going to focus on the 2 presidential frontrunners of Trump and Harris. We have never had polls at this stage in the race this close. And we have to remind ourselves, in 2020, the presidential election was decided by less than 45,000 votes spread amongst 3 states. And in 2016, it was about 78,000 votes spread amongst 3 states. So super, super close elections. But yet the polling in 2016 and 2020 had a wider gap between the 2 candidates, Democrat and Republican candidates, than we see at this point. So at the risk of boring you, I thought we might talk a little bit about, can we trust these polls? A little bit about the details of some of these polls. We can't possibly do it justice in 7 minutes. I think we'd also need a mathematician to explain to us some of the science behind some of these. But I do worry that many of us just say, oh, the polls are wrong, and we can't trust the polls. So Did either of you want to start? Do you want me to start on this and you chime in?
Well,
How do you?
I'll start
go
a
ahead.
little bit. I don't know if I trust polls, but what I always look for is that when you're looking at a poll and you see the number of people, you'll see the letter N, which is the number of respondents. Now I'm talking like, sorry, we're going to talk political science here, but you see the N. The N should be between at least 1,000 people. And you want to make sure that the N, the number of respondents, if it's over 1,000, says LV next to it. That says that those people that they're showing you the poll results from are likely voters. If you see RV, those are registered voters, but they might not show up to vote. If you see A, those are adults. Those are people over the age of 18, and that's basically it. Okay, whether they're registered or not, or likely or not, they're just adults. So I always look at it and say, if I'm going to see a poll number and it has over 1,000 people, I want to make sure it has likely voters. I also want to make sure that the polling company, now you have to research it yourself, or who conducted the poll, is from a university or college. It's from a media organization like the Washington Post or NBC News or ABC, even Fox News polls. And then you want to make sure that the polling company that's doing it, if it's an independent company, is a reputable company such as Gallup, for example. But you'd have to research it. You'd actually have to find it out yourself. So do I trust polls? I trust the ones that if they come from reputable sources. But the end result is that whether or not I agree with the polls is one thing, but I still have to, and you still have to show up in November and vote. Or if you're not going to do it in November, you can always early vote. So the poll numbers are one thing, but it's actually you taking action afterwards that matters the most.
Yep. My colleagues know I've been struggling a bit with polls, and it's something that we've talked about maybe doing a podcast on specifically because there is a scientific method behind polling. It's not like people just kind of make things up out of thin air. They try to get in the most random sample of people as possible so that, you're not, if we're asking a group of college students, do you believe that marijuana should be legalized? Probably the results are going to be a little bit more skewed towards a yes, right? So you want to have as random of a sample as you possibly can. That being said, one of the things I'm struggling with still, because I keep trying to find literature on this issue, is how respondents are being reached. It's extremely difficult to even get people on the. I mean, how many of you answer your phone nowadays? Traditionally, polling, yeah, right. I'll get a couple of us, but traditionally, polling has been like the most, usually the safest way to conduct polling has been via poll or by a phone, right? You call people, you call randomly. Well, if people are not answering their phones as much as possible, it's taking longer and longer to get respondents to respond. And conducting polls by on the web, on the internet, are not necessarily also the most reliable. So that is a major concern about that. Not to mention in the past couple of elections, are people being honest in their responses? Are they giving pollsters an answer that they want to hear, or are they actually being? So that those numbers between those who are perhaps responding and our Trump supporters, are they being as forthcoming as possible, or is there too much of a bias based on how pollsters sometimes weigh certain issues more than others in polls? And it's also important to remember these are just a snapshot of a particular moment in time, right? Things can shift. We're still 6 weeks out of the election. So much can change in 6 weeks, folks. And October is always the month where they talk about the October surprise. Things always happen. In 2016, there were some major moments. It was like this constant drama. Is that also going to happen for this election too? There's likely to be one or two things. So, but have those numbers shifted that much, that monumentally? So for example, the New York Times Siena poll that came out a few days ago showed, or was it yesterday, the one that showed that Trump ahead nationally by 1 point, but in Pennsylvania, the last couple of months have come out showing that, or last couple of polls that have come out have been showing her up by 4. So I think we have to look at, again, as Professor Schreck talked about, whether or not the polls are those that conducting them. Are they? What is the scientific method they use? How responsible, how correct they've been in the past, and kind of aggregate those numbers and look to see, okay, what is the overall trend showing? But yeah, this is a nail biter for sure.
A couple things to add to this is, so 1,000 people on average is generally a good number if the sample is random. So the idea would be like if every single registered voter, if we're going to focus on them, had the same likelihood of being selected, right? So even if you have that, though, in my class, we'll get to this in chapter 8, you have a margin of error, sampling error, when you only have 1,000 people. Generally, 1,000 is a good number, and it's really hard to get 1,000 respondents to participate. It takes time, it's expensive. But when you get plus or minus 3%, we're just going to look at this top one from the Siena. I wish I had my pointer, but let's just focus on the Siena poll from North Carolina. So Trump's ahead by 3. So Trump supporter, you're like, great, we got North Carolina in the bag. But almost every survey with 1,000 people are going to have a margin of error or sampling error of plus or minus 3%. So the bottom one, okay. So really, Trump, this could be tied. Trump could be up by 6. We don't know. And a lot of the experts in polling would say you really need to double the margin of error. And really, you should only be looking at the polls in the final week of the election because so much is going to change. And so you take all of this with a grain of salt right now. But that being said, these polls are generally pretty good. If you look historically over time, you know, in one of my classes, I've shown the polls before 2016. They showed Hillary Clinton was going to win, that she was going to win by about 4%, 3%, something like that, 2%. She ended up winning the national popular vote by 2%. So one of the first things we have to remember is this is not a nationwide popular vote. What we really have, and we'll spend more time on this in 4 weeks, is the Electoral College. So we really need to be looking at those battleground, we call them battleground, because that's the states that's going to be fought out, where the candidates are spending their time and money because we don't actually know who's ahead or behind. A few of those states are Pennsylvania is probably number 1, Georgia, North Carolina, Michigan, Wisconsin, Nevada, Arizona. Again, we'll spend more time on those later. But within those, we see a really, really tight margin between these two candidates. And one of the other things that we've been, when we, not me, but a lot of these polling, there's aggregators like Nate Silver who will take not just one poll, but dozens of the best polls that are ranked well in transparency. And they will, now right now I just want to be clear, we're looking nationally. And this is not one poll, but it's a collection of some of the best polling organizations that we have. And nationally, Harris is up by close to 3%. And you can see how this has evolved over time. But again, if you're Joe Biden was ahead by 8% the final week of 2020. Joe Biden did not win by 8%, he won by 4%. When he won by 4%, it translated into Electoral College vote win of about 44,000 votes. So it is possible, and we could, I wish we had more time to spend on this. A lot of what these to Mary's point that when Gallup is calling people and nobody's answering their phone, and then they get 1,000 people, let's say 70% of them are female, or 80% of them are over age 65, we know that is not a representative sample of the American public. So this is where it gets more into science. A lot of these organizations are now weighting. They're going to overweight for the samples, for the groups of people that were underrepresented in their poll. So they might, if there was only, let's say, 30% males who participated in this survey, they may do a multiplier effect for the males who did participate. One of the things that these organizations have done, the good ones, is instead of just weighting based on race or age, and they used to weight by like 5, maybe 3 to 5 variables, some of the good ones are now doing it by 12. And one of the key demographics that they've added is education level. We've seen that this is one of the huge divides between modern Democrats and Republicans is, did you graduate college? Did you go to college? Those without a college degree are much more likely to be Republican, especially a Trump supporter, like a Trump MAGA Republican than a Democrat. So when we properly account for all these weighted variables, these polls get better. And one of the things we saw in 2022, those surveys, those polls were actually pretty good. Especially when you take in that margin of error. of plus or minus 3%. Many of those surveys are within those range. Yeah, I think based on the time that we have, we're down to 15 minutes. Let's turn it over to you. What questions do you have? Maybe something that we covered, maybe something we neglected, other thoughts on the 2024 election, anything.
Or what issues are most important to all of you? That's what I'm curious about.
And I do have a microphone to hand you.
So you said Montana has the abortion issue on the ballot. How do you think that's going to affect the Senate race for Chester? Would it drive Democrats to come out?
Traditionally, it has in the last couple elections where abortion rights have been on the ballot, even in red states, even when they've been special elections, when they've been done in an off time, like in the summer, it has driven people out. So that's one of those issues where it seems to be like, whether it's Republican or Democrat, there's widespread support for enshrining, for protecting abortion rights. So I would imagine it would perhaps help somewhat, but the polls there are, again, can we trust the polls? But I would imagine it would drive some turnout.
And the other thing I
What is
wanted
it?
to mention was I just read yesterday, they were doing polling and it said to get one respondent, the person had to call like 2 hours to get
Yes.
one person to
That is
respond.
correct.
So time and money, again.
Very
So,
expensive.
Back that up.
And historically, when I say historically, the last 8 years with Trump, there's been what's sometimes called a Trump shy voter. Like, hey, we've got this Gallup, they're calling me, wanting to know if I'm a Trump supporter. I hear the media talk bad about him, or maybe I'm too shy to. And so I think it's been harder to capture certain groups. There's the groups of people who are more likely to participate in polls might be more likely to be Democrats by a slight advantage here. Well, when you're in a 50-50 election, you know, those slight differences can really tweak these polls. But again, in 2022, we've largely improved a lot of these surveys. And the other dynamic here, as you mentioned, Roe v. Wade being overturned and the Dobbs decision, the Democratic experts, if you will, who might want Harris and Democrats to win, they're suggesting that the polls historically were underrepresenting white males without a college degree. Now, Democrats think that the polls are underestimating females with a college degree. That one of the things we don't know, who's actually going to show up in November. We have a lot of models. We can ask you, are you going to vote? We can ask you whether you voted in the past. We cannot, you know, you could get sick that day, which by the way is why you should early vote and vote by mail, but we don't know who's gonna actually show up. And since the Dobbs decision, we have definitely seen across the states that have had special elections and the 2022 election, Democrats overperform. Maybe for various reasons, but this is one that is a big explainer. And I think to your point about Montana, Tester seems to be ahead or behind by maybe 5-6 points. But again, that's amongst a survey. We don't know who the actual people are going to show up on election day.
Well, because like we all get our phone calls, right? And you see a number and it says unknown caller, so you don't answer. Or it says like spam possible, so you don't answer. Or it says that it's from your aunt and you don't answer. I mean, like, trust me on that one. So there are things that you just don't answer the phone. So we don't know who's being polled and we don't know how many people are going to be polled at a given time. And to answer your question about Montana, I'll just look at it this way. The rhetoric that's out there, this one just came out in Ohio. Now, Ohio just passed a law that would protect abortion rights in the state. There is a race for the United States Senate. The Republican candidate came out just yesterday or on Friday and said the following: you know, the left has a lot of single issue voters. Sadly, by the way, there's a lot of suburban women, a lot of suburban women that are like, listen, abortion is it. And if I can't have an abortion in this country whenever I want, I will vote for someone else. It's a little crazy, by the way, but especially for women that are like past 50, I'm thinking to myself, I don't think that's an issue for you. So, you know, the rhetoric that's out there. Right. So, I mean, you have to pay attention to the rhetoric that's out there. And like we were saying before, as you get closer and closer to the election, it's coming up in October, you're going to see statements like this. You're going to see you're going to see news that's coming out. There's a person who's running for re-election for the House of Representatives in New York. There's a story that just came out that he had a lover on the side and put her on the payroll to work for him in the House of Representatives, paying her $2,000 a month. That just came out. It's not that it didn't exist months ago. People knew it, and now all of a sudden the news is coming out today. Just so happens 40-something days right before the election. So when we're polling people, to go back to that, we're polling people of what they know right now. What's going to happen tomorrow? We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. Then we have to poll again to get people's reactions.
Other questions?
Okay, so it's a little bit of a stretch, but do you think that the Roe v. Wade, the whole abortion thing, was because of like a population decline? Is that why they brought it up?
No. Meaning, is that why the Supreme Court overturned it? No, it's because it's been a campaign for decades since Roe versus Wade was first decided in the mid 70s or 1973 that there's been an active campaign, particularly from the 80s onward, because abortion used to be an issue that Republicans and Democrats, because there were more so-called liberal Republicans and there were more conservative Democrats who were maybe against abortion, and some Republicans who were in favor of allowing a woman's right to choose. But this has been a campaign that went on for decades trying to get Roe versus Wade overturned. And I think a lot of voters were complacent for a long time. They were just kind of like, oh, that's never going to. I was one of them. I voted regardless, but I was one of those people thinking they're not going to overturn a precedent like that. No way. But they did. And it was kind of put into place over the last few years with Donald Trump becoming president in 2016 by promising evangelical Christian voters, I will put judges in place who will overturn Roe versus Wade. So this is not something that just kind of came. This has been an active campaign for years. And now what's interesting is that now that that's happened, the irony is that there are a lot of the pro-life movement is kind of stalling. They're not quite sure what to do from now. It's almost like you want something for so long that you get it and you're like, oh, now what do I do? And that seems to be kind of a major, because they're seeing that in state after state, whether it's a state like Kentucky or it's a state like Ohio or it's a state like Kansas, they're all voting in favor of it. Well, there's a reason for that. When you have something that's been enshrined and protected for decades, and because it's not just about the idea of simply getting an abortion, it's about if you have a miscarriage and you need a DNC to be able to go find a doctor who's willing to do it. And you're seeing across the country, particularly in states like Idaho, where there's now one OBGYN for 200 miles for women. Well, when you're pregnant and you're in your last trimester, you have to go every week to see a doctor and have an exam done. Doctors are leaving these states in droves. So it's interesting how this is really kind of a losing issue, which is why Donald Trump has been backpedaling on what he was saying before about the idea of abortion and that he would not sign a bill like that. And because he knows now that people are very loud and clear about this, how they feel about it. Thank you. Good question.
No, my mic is working now. I do think that, so as Professor Faflis pointed out, for maybe 5 decades, there's been many conservatives who were upset with Roe v. Wade and who believe passionately about protecting the unborn child. And I think there's some legal scholars who felt that the Roe v. Wade decision was interpreting a right in the Constitution that wasn't explicitly in the Constitution. And so, and Trump campaigned on this, that he would have Supreme Court nominees, justices who would overturn Roe v. Wade. And it's kind of a quirk of the way it worked, that he, in a 4-year time period, was able to nominate 3 Supreme Court justices, one of which I mentioned earlier occurred during Obama's time period, but the Senate essentially blocked that nominee. So Trump inherited that nominee and got to appoint Gorsuch because they said that in the final year of an election, we're not going to vote on, we're not going to have a hearing on a Supreme Court nominee. And then Kennedy, a Supreme Court justice, retired during the Trump administration, and they replaced him with Kavanaugh. And then, in a couple months, not quite 2 months before 6 weeks. And if you remember, 2020, people were already voting early because of COVID and mail-in ballots. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, a liberal justice, passed away. And despite their kind of precedent in 2016, 17 of not having a Supreme Court nomination during an election year, Trump quickly nominated Amy Coney Barrett, and she was confirmed relatively quickly before the 2020 election. So those three Supreme Court nominees together with Thomas and Alito were able to overturn Roe v. Wade in a 5-4 decision, essentially.
Yeah, I can answer. Other questions? Yeah, come.
Ladies and gentlemen, Troy is walking around the library right now. That's why there's a pause.
There should just be a quick question, but you said that there are 3 states that that are kind of like the main figure in like switching between either like Democratic or Republic. What are they? Just like the 3 main states that like I feel like we should be focusing on whether or not.
The battleground states, you mean?
Yeah.
I'd say 3 of the biggest. So in 2016, I think the surprise for Democrats, they considered this blue wall of states that had voted for Democrats since the 1992 election. And Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania were kind of considered in the bag for Democrats. And then Trump barely won them. It was like Michigan by 11,000 votes, 40,000 votes in Pennsylvania, and 20-some thousand votes in Wisconsin. Biden won those 3 states, a couple of which, like Wisconsin, barely by, again, around 11, 12,000 votes, something like that. So those are 3 of the biggest ones. I think we'll show in 4 weeks that Pennsylvania is number 1. It's going to be really hard for Democrats to put together a coalition of states that add up to 270 electoral college votes without Pennsylvania. And if you look at where the candidates are spending their time and their money between Trump and Harris, that is it. That is the ball game in a lot of different ways. For Republicans, they really need Georgia. Democrats barely won Georgia in 2020. If they were to win it again, which I don't think they will, but if they were to win it again, it's going to be really hard for Trump and the Republicans to put together a coalition of 270. So, I mean, Democrats have to have, like, we'll show there's like 7 different scenarios that this could come down to, but one of which, this blue wall of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania add up to 270, which is the minimum you need to win, only with the Nebraska 2nd Congressional District, because Nebraska has 3 separate House of Representative races or districts, and those are 3 separate elections, if you will, for the Electoral College. So the only way Democrats would get to 270 by winning those blue wall states of Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania is if they simultaneously win the 2nd district. Republicans recently tried to make Nebraska go to a winner-take-all system. It looks like that's not going to work. They're not going to make that last-minute change in this election cycle.
I like the fact that we have 2 states that border us pretty much, Michigan and Wisconsin, where if you're interested to see how the democratic process works, go to those 2 states and participate, whatever candidate that you support. Go out and see what it's like to be in a state where their vote does matter when it comes to the Electoral College. I think it's very exciting. Like I said, to be in Michigan for a weekend, visiting our son and watching like all these television commercials, being bombarded about every active race that's out there. It just shows you how the democratic process works. And it's very exciting when you see that in a state where it's a 50-50 result.
I love that. Yeah, within an hour drive, you can be 2 of the biggest battleground states in 2024 presidential election cycle.
Yeah, pretty much.
You can write postcards, you can phone bank, you can drive to these places, help knock on doors and get out the vote for your respective candidate that you prefer. And as it happens, both of those 2 states also have really key House of Representative races that will help determine which party is the majority for the House of Representatives.
That's right.
All right. Thanks, everybody, for coming today, and thanks to my panel members, Dr. Schreck and Mary Pflies-Dunkel, and look forward to hopefully seeing you again in 1 month, 4 weeks from now, where we talk about the Electoral College. Thank you.
Thank you. tell you, man. No, that's good. I had a lot of tea this
No, you're
morning. My
fine.
meds are working.
I gotta get to class.
I was a little bit active.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Amy.